Hey, so let's talk about some of the subject matter we're going to hit on in this,
Okay,
on this first program.
Are you on, or are you going to be on?
Yeah, I'll be on.
Okay. The greatest story never told in a nutshell? I beg you in a way that is worthy of thinking beings. Do not model yourself on the behavior of the world around you, but let your behavior change, modeled by your new mind. This is the essence of the greatest story never told. When first I read these words of Paul to the Romans 12:2, I was deeply ensconced in the study of history and political philosophy. Indeed, this observation took place in the middle of a college political philosophy class, being taught by, of all people, a Presbyterian minister. I say of all things because Christianity looks implacably down upon philosophy and philosophers as it's in God's bitterest of enemies. Rome rewrote the Bible and the history and the philosophy of the classical period, and it was Rome, not God, who created Christianity. Rome did all this and much more, including mass murder, to destroy the truth-centered radical movement that was sweeping the empire in philosophy, religion, and politics. The revolutionary movement of such rational force and widespread public support that it was on the verge of finally bringing down the Roman Empire. At the head of this enlightened revolution were the Jews, and the movement itself was Judaism, the radical philosophical religion of the intertestamental Jews. The greatest story ever told is a false story. It's a story created by the Romans to replace the Jews in the minds of the people of that time by making them look like the bad guys. As an example, we can see this hand of Rome at work in our Bible, which is broken into two books called the Old Testament and the New Testament. That idea that there is an Old Testament, or to say an Old Covenant, and that's the covenant of the Jews, and that there is a New Covenant, and that is the covenant of Christianity, that is the hand of Rome. That's certainly not Jewish. The Jews do not believe that their covenant with God is over with. They do not believe it is the Old Covenant. So this is the Christian or the Roman lie in a nutshell, and we see it right here in the Bible. This is called the biblical philosophy of history. And that is, briefly, that throughout the Bible you will see where the Jews do the wrong thing, they sin against God. God then punishes them, usually by causing them to be in bondage to some third nation, which is usually much worse than the Jews have ever been, like the Assyrians or the Romans. And then when he feels that they've suffered enough, he redeems them. This is called the biblical philosophy, or the biblical philosophy. Biblical philosophy of history, or also in biblical scholarship it's known as the Deuteronomistic structure. Now, the New Testament represents the point in that long history of where the Jews constantly get in God's face and make him angry, that he finally reached the point where he doesn't want to redeem them anymore. He's had enough with them. He is going to reject them and create a new chosen people, new Jews, if you will, which we now call Christians, the new covenant. Because the Jews have so constantly done this that they finally just angered God so much, the last straw broke the camel's back. That's the biblical philosophy of history. That is a false philosophy. For this reason, we'll start right off with. The Jews are not impious, apostate types. Quite the opposite. They are extremely, if you'll excuse the word, zealous. And that was the big problem back in the days of Rome. It was the zealous Jews, and they were called the zealots, who were in Rome's face, who were leading the charge against Rome. Mm-hmm. So they were not being something that God wouldn't like, quite the opposite. They were being something that God would like. On Masada, the story that we get is that a man named Eleazar ben Yair is up on Masada with about 1,000 of his followers. They're the remains of the Zealot movement, and the Romans have surrounded them. And they've been up there for quite a while. In fact, the Jews took it over from the Romans in 66 CE or AD, and this is 74 AD, and the Jews have possessed and held Masada all this time, a fortress that the Romans couldn't take back. They could only surround it. They didn't know how to get up there. The Jews did. And they had held it for 8 years and used it during the war with Rome. Now the Romans, after they've wiped out the temple and destroyed Jerusalem, have surrounded Masada, and this is supposed to be the last stronghold of the Zealots. Supposedly, these Zealots all commit suicide rather than let the Romans imprison them. All right, this, according to the Jewish Roman historian named Josephus, who is really a Roman propagandist, tells us that Eleazar ben Yair up on Masada gives as the reason for their defeat at the hands of Roman is that they have not been good Jews. which is the same thing Paul and the New Testament is telling us, and we know that that is false. And those people up on the top of Masada who have been dying by the millions for the last 10 years in this great war with Rome are ample evidence of the fact that quite the opposite of being apostates or anti-God, they have put it all on the line for God. And so Eleazar would never have said these words. So we know this is a falsehood. Okay, where did this falsehood come from? We know the Old Testament is not the way the Jews regard their covenant with God. Where did this concept come from? What's the purpose of it? We only need to look and see what's happened. The Roman Empire became the Holy Roman Empire. Christianity did not become a Jewish religion. Its headquarters is not in Jerusalem. It's in Rome. It is a Roman religion, plain and simple. And the reason for doing it is very obvious, is that the Jews were causing the Romans a great deal of political problem, and the way to get rid of them was to turn the Jews' own religion against them, turn their own God against them, and by so doing, discredit them morally in the eyes of the whole world who were on their side, and pull the classic role reversal, reactionary role reversal, and we see it in the Bible where Paul tells you to obey Caesar because Caesar is God's agent. Well, before the Jews were God's agents, they were the chosen. Now the Romans have become God. That's called a reactionary role reversal, where they become the bad guy becomes the good guy, and the good guy becomes a heretic or a subversive. We see it all around us all the time. This was the trick that was played, and it's right in front of us, and that's what I would like to start with, is by showing you evidence that the hand of Rome is in our Bible and that it's false. We'll start off with the original sin story. We have two creation stories in the Bible. The first one, I would get out the Bible here at this point, tells us that when it was all over with, God created the heavens and the earth for 6 days and rested on the seventh day and so forth, and he created man and woman in his image at the same time. Look in your Bible, folks, that's what it says. And then he checked it all out, and he was very pleased with what he had done, which of course God would be. God doesn't make any mistakes. And then the second chapter starts in the Bible, and it starts again as if God hasn't already created Adam and Eve. It's pre-Adam and Eve, and we go through the story of how he creates Adam and then takes a rib and creates Eve, which is a totally different story than the first chapter, mind you. And then we go into the Garden of Eden chapter, and here is where we see the hand of Rome coming in. The Adam and Eve story, the original sin story, doesn't have hardly any reference to it in the Old Testament. They don't talk about it. It's something that was added much later, and we can assume that it was added at the same time that Pauline doctrine was introduced into the Bible, because Paul uses the original sin doctrine. It's fundamental to his doctrine of why Jesus the Savior is here, to save us from the Jews, i.e. from Adam's original sin against God in the Garden of Eden. And Jesus has come from God to save us from that sin. Well, what is that sin? It's eating the fruit of the tree of knowledge. Well, what is the fruit of the tree of knowledge? It's truth. God is truth. Because does God really not want us to know truth? Not want us to know God? That's false. Would God make us rational, self-determined human beings who need the truth to guide us in all we do, and then be angry at us because we do like he made us to be? This is a God that can't get his act together. He's got it wrong. This is not God, folks. And in the ancient times, a group of early Christians called Gnostics referred to this God in our Bible today as Satan, because of this great evil that he hates us for being human. That's our original sin, folks. It ain't sex. It's for wanting to know what the truth is. You're supposed to let God tell you what the truth is. That is to say Paul. That is to say the Bible. That is to say the church. Who is ever in control of these matters. That's where you're supposed to get it from. If you look in a Catholic book called On Reason and Religion, I think I have it here somewhere. If I can find it, just bear with me a minute on... Turn it off for just a moment. I'll get this for you. This is good. It's a Catholic University teaching book. It covers Aquinas. It's a philosophy book on right and reason. That's what it's called. Now, how you determine what's right and how you determine what's reasonable is by truth. You know when the right time to cross the street is because the truth of the traffic pattern tells you. If you will go against that truth, you're going to get hit by a car, you're going to suffer. So the purpose of truth is to guide us through life. You use reason based on that truth to know when to cross the street. If you see the truth in the matter and recognize that the cars are coming, and that's the truth, but at the same time walk out anyway, you're not being reasonable, again you will be hit. So they go together. reason and truth. And yet in this Bible by the Catholics on reason and truth, in logic and so forth, if you look in the index, there is no truth. There is no word truth. There's the word God, but truth is not in the index of their book of logic. How do you know what's true if you, what's right and reasonable if you don't know what's true? You go to God. Who's God?
Mm-hmm.
I gotta...
Rome's God.